at the Institute, we really believe that operational real estate is the future of how this industry is going to develop. So I'm very excited to be here. And today I'm going to talk to you about macro. I don't really like talking about macro, and especially not to real estate people, especially not to people who do operational real estate, because I really believe that at the end of the day, real estate is very local. But there is no way around the fact that everything we do has to be put in the context of the global trends and the macroeconomic trends that we observe. So today, I'm going to try to discuss the most important trends that we see globally at the moment. Now, of course, it's really hard to discuss macro and be original, because all the important stuff that we need to pay attention to, everybody knows about. So rather than try to come up with something new that you haven't heard of, I'm going to try to cover the most important trends and be insightful, give you an academic perspective on those trends. So just to motivate that I really do think that we live in interesting times, interesting for an academic, uncertain for a person that is trying to get some business done, I wanted to show you some news headlines. This is The Economist, worried about the impact of an armed conflict between superpowers on the financial system. Super interesting for an academic, terrifying for somebody in the industry. This is Bloomberg, worried about, Fed officials are worried about persistent inflation. You know, the inflation that was supposed to be transitionary and go away doesn't want to go away. And they're worried about inflation staying higher for longer. Again, super interesting for an academic, not great for the economy. Here, there is CNN looking at the impact of geopolitical risk on investment and trying to figure out, okay, what should we invest into given the level of geopolitical risk? Again, for an academic, brilliant, not so great for investors. And this is the BBC, worried about slowing economic growth globally. And yes, academics are studying this. People in the economy or in the industry are worried about this. So interesting times for an academic, uncertain times for the industry. And this is why today I'd like to focus on uncertainty. First, I'm going to give you an overview of my 3 favorite uncertainty factors. I'm going to try to provide a new perspective, and then I'm going to try to link them to what this means for operational real estate. So, as I said, my 3 favorite sources of uncertainty. First, global economic trends. I don't think any of these needs an introduction. I'm sure you are bored to death of listening about interest rates. I'm an academic who studies these things, and I'm bored to death of listening about interest rates. We've been listening about them for the last couple of years. Trade, ever since Donald Trump started trade wars with China, globalization seems to have been reversing, and I don't have to tell you about this. And finally, I don't have to tell you about the war in Ukraine, the situation in Israel, or the possible conflict between China and Taiwan. So these are the trends that I will cover in a minute. Then I will move on to technological changes. I will focus on automation and work from home. Again, neither of this, I think, is new. And finally, I will move over to something that is probably part of every single important presentation at the moment, which is ESG. We've been talking about environmental and climate risks for a very long time. Today, I wanted to just point to the risks related to insurance and regulations. So I'm going to go through the list now, but I'm not going to start with interest rates. I'm going to cover everything else and then come back to interest rates just because of how I want to structure the argument. The first point I would like to make is about trade. And this graph comes from the IMF and looks at the number of trade restrictions imposed annually worldwide. And bear in mind, these are cumulative, right? So once we impose them, they add up. And of course, it has been increasing. That isn't new. The point I would like to make here is that the political discourse is moving away from seeing economics as left versus right, and is starting to see economics as open versus closed. Because globalization is reversing, because it hasn't worked for everybody equally. Research shows that it has benefited the rich, but it didn't do anything for the poor apart from destroying some of their jobs. So the political discourse at the moment is very much open versus closed, and this is what's going to drive the reversing globalization in the future. The second point I wanted to make is about wars. This is a map of countries that are currently at war. And the thing that should jump out at you is that there's a lot of them. In Europe, over the past couple of decades, we've enjoyed a period of unprecedented peace, but it looks like that period is now over because of the war in Ukraine, and we now need to understand that we need to increase our defense spending and worry about defense and security a lot more. Whether it's the possibility of a conflict between China and Taiwan, or China and the US, or the situation in Israel, the point I'm trying to make here is that physical security is important, and we've neglected it, and now we are starting to understand that it's still important, that the risk hasn't gone away, it's part of the world that we live in. The next point I wanted to make, now moving on to technological changes, is on automation. This graph gives you the types of jobs that are at risk, exposed to the risk of automation, or not exposed to that risk. This comes from the Office for National Statistics. And you probably have been seeing graphs like this for a while. The interesting point is that we see this in the data. Jobs, especially the jobs towards the top, are being destroyed, and people are being replaced by automated processes. So this is something that we see in the data. It's progressing slowly, and it doesn't make headlines for one reason or another, but it is happening. One point I wanted to make here is it is destroying jobs, but historically we've also seen that automation creates jobs. It just creates them in a different place than where it destroys them. So there's a spatial mismatch and there's a skill mismatch created by automation being widely adopted. The next point I want to make is on work from home. And yes, I know this is a very controversial topic. Many of you will have your own opinions on this. But the academic consensus at the moment is that hybrid is the best for firms and the best for workers. And this is research that came out a couple of weeks ago, but the best data that we have, the best natural experiments and the best studies that we've seen seem to suggest that hybrid is what companies and workers benefit from, and that means that work from home is here to stay. Maybe not 100% from home, but hybrid is, according to the academic consensus, the optimal model at the moment. And now I'm going to move on to environmental and climate risks. And the first point I would like to make is on insurance. Academics, for a very long time, decades, have been telling the insurance industry that they've been undervaluing the probability and the value of physical risk from climate change. And this graph is showing you the cost of US disasters, natural disasters, in dollars. It's been increasing. And based on graphs like this, the insurance industry is now starting to reevaluate their understanding of the probability and the cost of natural disasters. And of course, I don't have to tell you that this is problematic for us because our insurance premiums are going to go up in less than easy to predict ways. And the last point I wanted to make is on climate change policies and climate change regulations issued by governments. This is a map of countries that have climate laws on the books. And the point I think this graph makes really well is that most countries have them. The problem is that there is very little uniformity between the countries. Countries tend not to coordinate those laws, and they tend to issue them in a way that is inward-looking rather than outward-looking and coordinated. And that means that, yes, they are ubiquitous, but they are also relatively opaque. So when you move from country to country, the climate change laws are going to be very different. Okay, so now coming back to interest rates. And the point I wanted to make about interest rates is that in the long term, they are really easy to predict. In the short term, they are really hard to predict. How can I say this? How can I say that they are easy to predict in the long term? Well, look at this graph. These are global interest rates over the last 700 years. I'm sure you can see that the overall trend is clearly downward sloping. And it's easy to say that in the long term, interest rates are probably going to keep going down just because of this very long-term trend. I don't have the time to discuss the reasons for this downward sloping trend, but there is really good research that explains it. The fact that it's downward sloping in the long term doesn't change the fact that there are easily periods of 30, 50 years when interest rates are going up and stay high. So in the short term, predicting interest rates is hard. It's hard for two reasons. One is there is a lot of heterogeneity between countries. If you disaggregate this graph by country, you get this, a lot of heterogeneity. You probably can't see this, but in this graph, the slope for Germany is a lot flatter than for the UK. It's still negative in the long term, but it's a lot flatter. So that's what the first reason for interest rates being hard to predict in the short term. The second reason is the fact that actually interest rates are the outcome of all the other factors you see on the screen rather than the cause. So in order to try to predict short-term interest rates, we have to predict all the other things and the effect they have on the economy, which is hard to do because there's a reason we call them uncertainty. So this is why interest rates are hard to predict in the short term, because policymakers that set them react to the state of the economy. And now really quickly, I'm going to run through the effects I think these factors are going to have on operating of real estate. First, I think uncertainty about interest rates and the fact that they're a little higher means that there's going to be a lower amount of transactions. This is just how our market works. And that means that we need to start thinking about operating our assets for longer because the transaction market is going to be slowing down. The reversing globalization means that there's going to be something we call selective inflation. Every now and then, things like a ship stuck in the Suez Canal would cause really random costs to go up. Sometimes it might be a cleaning detergent. Sometimes it might be raw materials. Sometimes it might be lack of skilled labor. And the only way to hedge this risk is to try to diversify your operations and your suppliers. Changes in the geopolitical situation will mean that firms are going to reallocate their production. Whether it's a firm that tries to decouple from China, or a firm that suddenly finds that they can't access the right skilled labor in London anymore, and they have to move somewhere else because of immigration policies, firms will be looking for new locations, and new locations will become interesting for those firms just because the relocation of production is going to make them rethink the locations. Then automation is going to increase income inequality. We've seen this in history. Virtually every type of automation we have seen increased income inequality. If you're worried about this for your business, I would suggest trying to focus on customers that are going to be on the winning side. Otherwise, the demand for your services is going to go down. Work from home has created a new spatial structure of cities. Cities are no longer just about jobs. They are also about amenities just as much as they are about jobs. And that means that new locations are interesting. New locations are going to be growing just because now it's not just about access to the city center where the jobs are, but also access to the interesting amenities. Insurance costs are going to be rising. I think that's pretty clear. They're going to become a more and more significant expense item for everybody. And the only way to deal with this is to try to diversify your assets and your geographical locations. And the final point I wanted to make is that there's going to be disruption coming from environmental regulation. Just because making policy is incredibly hard, it's even harder for an asset class as heterogeneous as real estate. So there will be assets that you will be looking at, and then there will be policy that makes no sense for the asset, but you will still be expected to follow the policy. And this is going to be disruptive, and this is going to be disruptive for construction as well as for operation of real estate. So on that note, I'd like to finish. I don't really have time to take questions, unfortunately, but if you found any of this interesting or insightful, or you didn't find it interesting or you disagree, please find me during one of the breaks. I'd be delighted to get your feedback. Thank you very much.